Case 1. Elisa Baker. The girl who came from the other side of the world. There are crimes that shock a community. And then there are crimes that reach across oceans. The story of 10-year-old Zara Baker is one of those. It is the kind of case that, once you hear it, does not leave you. It lodged itself into the national consciousness in the autumn of 2010, and the questions it raised about child welfare, about the failures of those trusted to protect the vulnerable, about how evil can wear the face of normalcy, have never fully been answered. Zara Claire Baker was born on the 16th of November, 1999, in Wagga Wagga, New South Wales, Australia. From her very first years, life made extraordinary demands of her. At just 5 years old, she was diagnosed with osteosarcoma, bone cancer, a disease that required the amputation of her left leg below the knee and the removal of part of her right lung. The treatment left her profoundly deaf in both ears. She wore a prosthetic leg. She relied on hearing aids to connect with the world around her. She was a child already acquainted with suffering, a child who, by every account of those who knew her, had met that suffering with a spirit that was bright and undeniable. Her cancer went into remission in 2008. And that same year, everything in Zara's world changed. Her father, Adam Baker, had met a woman online, a woman named Elisa Fairchild, originally from Western North Carolina. Their relationship moved quickly. They married. And in 2008, Zara Baker left Australia for the first time in her life, traveling with her father to the small city of Hickory, North Carolina, to begin a new chapter. It would be the last chapter of her life. Elisa Fairchild Baker was, by the time she married Adam Baker, already a woman with a deeply complicated and troubling history. Elisa had been previously married 6 times and was still married at the time she married Adam Baker. She had children from previous relationships. Reports of abusive behavior toward her own biological children dated back to at least 1999, when the Department of Social Services in North Carolina had already opened investigations into her conduct. She was a woman who had drifted through relationships, through legal troubles, through systems that had flagged her and failed to stop her. When Zara arrived in North Carolina, the family settled in Hickory. Adam Baker worked long hours, early mornings, late evenings, leaving Elisa as the primary caregiver for Zara during most of the day. Elisa exerted significant control over daily family matters. This dynamic positioned Elisa as the dominant figure, with Adam later describing her as manipulative and abusive toward both him and Zara, characterizing their marriage as built on deception and deeming it his biggest mistake. Neighbors began to notice things. They saw a little girl who seemed isolated, a child who was rarely seen playing outside, rarely seen at all, a child whose disabilities, her missing leg, her hearing aids, the visible evidence of what cancer had already taken from her, seemed not to draw compassion from her stepmother, but contempt. Those who knew the family in Hickory would later describe Elisa Baker as controlling, volatile, and cold. They described a household where cruelty was normalized. What none of them knew, what none of them could have imagined, was how far that cruelty had already gone and how little time Zara had left. On the 1st of October, 2010, Adam Baker called 911. He told the dispatcher that his daughter Zara was missing. He said he had last seen her several days earlier and that he believed she had been abducted from her bedroom. He described finding a ransom note. The call triggered a massive response. The Hickory Police Department mobilized immediately. Volunteers flooded in from across Catawba County. The story spread nationally within hours. A disabled child, a cancer survivor, missing from her home. The public responded with an outpouring of concern. Search teams combed fields and forests. Flyers went up. Zara's face was everywhere. But law enforcement officials, almost from the beginning, were not convinced this was an abduction. The ransom note raised immediate red flags. Its language was unusual, its demands vague. There was no evidence of forced entry into the home. And crucially, the person who had been alone with Zara most consistently, the person who controlled the household, was Elisa Baker. Within the first 48 hours of the investigation, law enforcement attention shifted toward Elisa Baker as the primary person of interest. As investigators dug deeper into the household, what they uncovered was appalling. Evidence of chronic abuse began to emerge, not just suspicions, but physical evidence. Text messages retrieved from Elisa Baker's phone revealed a level of cruelty toward Zara that was staggering. In text messages, Elisa Baker had referred to Zara as a freaking idiot and discussed the child in deeply dehumanizing terms, suggesting she viewed Zara not as a child in her care, but as an obstacle, a burden, something to be managed and resented. Investigators also learned that Zara had not been enrolled in school. Despite being of school age and having been in the United States for 2 years, Zara had been almost entirely cut off from the outside world. There were no teachers checking on her, no classmates asking where she was, no social network outside the walls of that house. Elisa had made sure of that. The search for Zara Baker continued for weeks. It was not until late October of 2010 that the true horror began to be revealed. Human remains were found in multiple locations in Caldwell and Catawba counties in North Carolina. The remains had been dismembered, scattered across different sites, requiring forensic teams to piece together what had been done. The remains were eventually confirmed to belong to Zara Baker. The medical examiner's findings were devastating. The investigation revealed evidence of profound and prolonged physical abuse. Zara Baker, a 10-year-old girl who had already survived cancer, who had already had a leg amputated, who had already endured treatments that would break adults, had been subjected to sustained cruelty in the home where she was supposed to be safe. The medical examination found evidence consistent with blunt force trauma and determined that Zara had suffered injuries that were the result of repeated physical abuse prior to her death. What Elisa Baker had done to Zara's body after her death revealed a calculated, cold-blooded attempt to hide what she had done. The dismemberment of a child's body is not a spontaneous act. It requires planning, execution, and the complete suppression of whatever human empathy might otherwise intervene. It speaks to a level of detachment from Zara's humanity so profound that it is almost impossible to comprehend. One of the most chilling details of the case was the ransom note. Forensic analysis of the ransom note determined that it had been written by Elisa Baker herself. The note, which had been designed to suggest Zara had been taken by an unknown kidnapper, was a fabrication, a document created to buy time, to redirect suspicion, and to frame an innocent abduction narrative while the truth lay dismembered across 2 counties. It was, in its own way, a window into the mind of Elisa Baker. This was not a woman acting in a blind rage. This was a woman who, having killed a child, sat down and wrote a note designed to make investigators look elsewhere. She had a plan. She had taken steps. She was, in the most clinical and chilling sense of the word, calculating. In 2010, Elisa Baker was charged with second-degree murder in the death of Zara Baker. In August of 2012, Elisa Baker pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was sentenced to between 18 and nearly 23 years in prison. She was also convicted of separate charges related to the obstruction of justice and other crimes connected to the case. Beyond the murder charge, Elisa Baker faced additional sentencing for writing the false ransom note, a charge of filing a false police report, as well as charges related to obtaining property by false pretenses, charges that stemmed from a pattern of fraudulent behavior that investigators uncovered during their examination of her life. Adam Baker, Zara's biological father, was also charged in connection with the case, specifically for failing to report his daughter's death and for obstruction of justice. Adam Baker ultimately cooperated with investigators and was not charged with the murder itself, though his failure to protect Zara and his role in concealing what had happened resulted in his own legal consequences. The North Carolina community of Hickory was shattered. And across the ocean in Australia, the family Zara had left behind, grandparents, aunts, cousins who had known that bright little girl before cancer and before Elisa Baker, mourned a child who had survived so much only to be failed by the one person who was supposed to protect her. The case of Zara Baker prompted significant conversations in North Carolina and nationally about child welfare protocols, homeschooling oversight, and the visibility of disabled children within family systems. Child advocacy groups pointed to Zara's case as a critical example of how children with disabilities, particularly those who are isolated from school systems and public contact, are uniquely vulnerable to abuse that goes undetected. Zara Baker was 10 years old. She had beaten cancer. She had crossed an ocean. She had faced more in her short life than most people face in decades. She deserved protection. She deserved to grow up. Elisa Baker remains one of North Carolina's most reviled criminal figures, a woman who not only took the life of a disabled child, but who methodically tried to cover up what she had done, scattering the evidence of her crime across the Carolina countryside, as if Zara Baker's body were something disposable. She was not disposable. She was Zara, and we remember her. If this story has moved you, if you believe Zara's memory deserves to be kept alive, please take a moment right now to hit the like button, drop a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Time. Every subscription helps us keep telling these stories. Don't forget to hit the bell so you never miss a new documentary. Case 2. Khrystina Marie Rice. A life that never got to begin. There are crimes that live entirely in silence. They happen behind closed doors, in rooms where no one is watching, to victims who cannot yet speak. The murder of a newborn baby is, in many ways, the most complete and total silencing of a human life that exists, because the victim has not yet had the chance to make a sound, to be known, to leave any mark upon the world at all. Khrystina Marie Rice made sure of that. The case that emerged from Union County, North Carolina in 2019 is one that investigators, prosecutors, and community members have described as among the most disturbing they have ever encountered. Not because of its scale, there was one victim, one tiny, helpless, newborn victim, but because of the deliberateness, the coldness, the calculated decision to look at a life that had just begun and decide that it would end there, in a closet, wrapped in a trash bag. Union County is a prosperous suburban county southeast of Charlotte, a community of growing neighborhoods, good schools, and the kind of domestic normalcy that makes what happened in Khrystina Rice's home feel even more jarring by contrast. When law enforcement in Union County began investigating the circumstances surrounding Khrystina Marie Rice, what they found was a woman who had concealed her pregnancy, given birth in secret, and then made a deliberate series of decisions about what to do with the child she had brought into the world. Investigators discovered that Rice had given birth to a baby boy and subsequently beaten the child. The infant was then hidden in a closet, wrapped in blankets, and placed inside a trash bag. The baby boy, a child who had been alive, who had been born into this world with all the biological insistence of new life, was left there, hidden, discarded. The discovery of the child came through the kind of investigative follow-up that separates a functioning system from one that misses everything. When authorities were eventually alerted to the situation and conducted a search, the scene they found was one that seasoned law enforcement professionals described as deeply traumatic to process. The investigation into Khrystina Marie Rice was thorough and methodical. Forensic examination of the infant's remains confirmed that the child had suffered blunt force injuries, injuries that were the direct and intentional result of being beaten. This was not a case of accidental injury, medical misadventure, or a desperate mother making a terrible decision in a moment of panic. The injuries were consistent with deliberate, applied force against a newborn baby. The medical examiner's findings were unambiguous. This child had been beaten. This child had been killed. And then this child had been hidden, wrapped up and placed in a dark closet, as if the brief existence of this baby boy was something to be concealed and forgotten. The prosecution of Khrystina Marie Rice built its case on the physical evidence, the forensic findings, and the clear pattern of deliberate conduct that the evidence revealed. There was no credible narrative of accident here. There was no version of events that could accommodate what the forensic record showed and still arrive at innocence. Khrystina Marie Rice was tried on a charge of first-degree murder. Following the presentation of evidence and testimony, the jury returned a verdict of guilty of first-degree murder in the death of her newborn son. Rice was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the most severe sentence available under North Carolina law short of the death penalty. She will never be released. She will spend every remaining day of her life behind the walls of a North Carolina correctional facility. The case drew significant attention from advocates for newborn protection, organizations that work to ensure that women facing crisis pregnancies have access to resources, support, and safe haven options. North Carolina, like every state in the country, has a safe haven law, a law that allows a parent to surrender a newborn to a designated safe location, such as a hospital or fire station, without criminal penalty. Advocacy groups pointed to the Rice case as a critical reminder of the importance of safe haven laws and the need for their broader awareness, noting that the tragedy of what happened to this baby boy might have been prevented had those resources been utilized. One of the most haunting dimensions of this case is the question of identity. The baby boy killed by Khrystina Marie Rice was a newborn, a child who had not yet been named in any public record, whose brief existence between birth and death was entirely contained within the walls of a home, within the decisions of a mother who chose violence over any other option. He deserved a name. He deserved the chance to grow up in Union County, to go to school, to make friends, to become someone. He was someone. He was a human being who had done nothing but arrive in this world, and for that, he was beaten and hidden in a closet. Khrystina Marie Rice will never see freedom again. She will grow old behind bars, while the child she killed never had the chance to grow at all. These stories are hard to hear. They are supposed to be. If you are watching this documentary because you believe these victims deserve to be remembered, please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Time, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Your support keeps this channel going. Case 3. Genevieve Ellen Springer. The day a father came to collect his sons. There are moments in true crime history that defy the brain's ability to process them in real time. Moments when ordinary circumstances, a scheduled custody exchange, a knock on a door, the arrival of a parent to pick up their children, become the entry point into a nightmare that no one saw coming. The 12th of March, 2024 was supposed to be a routine day in Murphy, North Carolina. It was not. Murphy sits at the extreme western tip of North Carolina, nestled in the Cherokee County Highlands, surrounded by the Cherokee National Forest and the Nantahala National Forest. It is a small community, a town of a few thousand people, where everyone tends to know everyone, and where the pace of life still carries echoes of a different era. It is the kind of place where tragedy hits not just one family, but an entire town. Genevieve Ellen Springer was a resident of Murphy. She was the mother of 4-year-old twin boys. And on that Tuesday in March of 2024, their father came to the home to collect the boys as part of a custody arrangement, a routine exchange of the kind that happens thousands of times a day across America without incident. What the father found when he arrived at that house in Murphy was not a routine custody exchange. What he found was something no parent should ever have to encounter. When the father arrived at the residence for the custody exchange, he discovered the bodies of his 2 4-year-old twin sons. Both children were dead. Law enforcement was called immediately, and Genevieve Ellen Springer was taken into custody. The Cherokee County Sheriff's Office and the State Bureau of Investigation launched an immediate and comprehensive investigation into the deaths. The scene at the Murphy residence was processed as a crime scene from the outset. There was no ambiguity, no question of natural cause. Genevieve Ellen Springer was charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. She was held without bond, reflecting the severity of the charges and the court's determination that she represented a significant risk. The community of Murphy reacted with shock that was almost total. In a town that small, the murder of 2 4-year-old boys by their own mother, discovered by their own father on what should have been an ordinary Tuesday, was the kind of event that fractures a community's sense of normalcy in ways that take years to repair. Vigils were held. Parents held their own children a little tighter. The elementary school that the twins might one day have attended sat a few blocks from where their lives ended. 4 years old. Let that number settle for a moment. These were not children who had lived long enough to have enemies, to have created conflict, to have done anything that could, even in the most distorted reasoning, justify what was done to them. They were 4-year-old boys. They were at the age of asking endless questions about the world. They were at the age of learning to ride bikes and count to 20 and figure out what their favorite color was. They were entirely, totally, completely innocent. As of the most recent available reporting, Genevieve Ellen Springer remains held without bond on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The case is proceeding through the North Carolina court system. Given the nature of the charges and the evidence that law enforcement described at the scene, legal analysts who have followed the case anticipate that Springer will face trial on both counts. First-degree murder in North Carolina carries a mandatory sentence of life in prison without parole or death. In either outcome, Genevieve Ellen Springer faces the certainty of spending the rest of her life behind bars. The twin boys, 4 years old, found by their father, gone before the world had a chance to know them, are the center of this story. Their names have been protected in many reports out of respect for the surviving family. But their existence was real. Their deaths were real. And the accountability of the person responsible for those deaths is very real. Murphy, North Carolina continues to grieve. Some wounds in small towns never fully close. If you are still with us, thank you for watching. These stories matter. These victims matter. Please like this video, leave a comment below, and subscribe to Cold Case Time so you never miss a documentary. We are grateful for every single one of you. Case 4, Blanche Taylor Moore, the widowmaker of Alamance County. If you were to design, in fiction, a story about a female serial poisoner, methodical, patient, operating over decades, hiding in plain sight behind the appearance of devoted domesticity, you would create something very close to the real story of Blanche Taylor Moore. The difference is that Blanche Taylor Moore is not fiction. She is real. She has been real for decades. And as of the time of this documentary's writing, she remains one of the most significant figures in North Carolina criminal history. A woman who turned arsenic into a weapon, deployed it against the people closest to her, and operated so effectively for so long that she nearly escaped justice altogether. She is currently on death row. She has been on death row for more than 3 decades. And the full scope of what she may have done has likely never been fully established. Blanche Taylor was born in 1933 in Stokes County, North Carolina. Her early life was shaped by poverty and by a deeply religious upbringing, factors that would later provide a jarring backdrop against which her crimes would be understood. She presented herself throughout her adult life as a devout, church-going woman, a helpful neighbor, a caring presence, a woman of faith. Blanche Taylor Moore worked for many years as a cashier at a Kroger supermarket, where she was known to colleagues as friendly and diligent. She was the kind of woman who seemed unremarkable in the best possible way, pleasant, ordinary, invisible. But beneath that ordinariness, something else entirely was operating. The investigation into Blanche Taylor Moore revealed a chilling pattern that stretched across more than 2 decades. The men and women in her life had a troubling tendency to fall ill with mysterious symptoms that, had anyone been looking with the right lens, would have pointed unmistakably toward arsenic poisoning. Blanche's first husband, James Taylor, died in 1973 after an extended illness characterized by symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning. At the time, his death was attributed to natural causes, and no investigation was launched. Her father, P.D. Kaiser, died under similar circumstances. The pattern continued with Raymond Reed, Blanche's longtime boyfriend, who became ill in 1986 and died in 1989 after a prolonged deterioration. His symptoms, gastrointestinal distress, neurological decline, weakness, were consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning, but he too was not initially identified as a poisoning victim. The case that ultimately brought Blanche Taylor Moore to justice was the near death of the Reverend Dwight Moore. Blanche Taylor Moore met Reverend Dwight Moore, a minister, and their relationship led to marriage. It was, by all outward appearances, a second chance. A woman of faith marrying a man of the cloth, a partnership that seemed to reflect the religious identity Blanche had cultivated over her lifetime. In 1989, shortly after their honeymoon, Reverend Dwight Moore became catastrophically ill. He was hospitalized with what initially appeared to be Guillain-Barré syndrome, a neurological condition that causes progressive muscle weakness and paralysis. His doctors were baffled by the severity of his condition and the speed of his decline. It was a physician at the hospital who, after reviewing Reverend Moore's symptoms and the trajectory of his illness, made the decision to order a toxicology screen that went beyond standard parameters. Toxicological testing revealed that Reverend Dwight Moore had extraordinarily elevated levels of arsenic in his system, levels consistent with deliberate, sustained poisoning rather than accidental exposure. The investigation that followed was swift and comprehensive. Law enforcement obtained exhumation orders for several individuals in Blanche's past. Exhumation and toxicological testing of Raymond Reed's remains confirmed the presence of arsenic at levels far exceeding any natural explanation. Testing of the exhumed remains of Blanche's first husband James Taylor also revealed evidence of arsenic poisoning. The picture that emerged was one of breathtaking calculated evil. Here was a woman who had poisoned men over the course of more than 2 decades, watching them decline, administering the arsenic gradually enough to mimic natural illness, collecting insurance proceeds, and moving on to her next relationship with the patience and composure of someone who had done this before, because she had. Blanche Taylor Moore was tried in 1990 for the murder of Raymond Reed. The prosecution presented toxicological evidence establishing that Reed had died of arsenic poisoning, and that the arsenic had been administered deliberately over a period of time. The jury convicted Blanche Taylor Moore of first-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to death. She became the first woman in North Carolina to be sentenced to death in the modern era. Blanche Taylor Moore has remained on death row at the North Carolina Correctional Institution for Women in Raleigh for more than 3 decades. She has filed numerous appeals over the years, all of which have been unsuccessful in overturning her conviction or sentence. She is currently in her early 90s. The Reverend Dwight Moore survived his poisoning, though the damage to his health was significant and lasting. He was the one who got away, the victim who lived long enough to lead investigators back through the trail of death that Blanche had left behind her. What makes Blanche Taylor Moore's case so uniquely disturbing is its duration. This was not a single act of violence in a moment of crisis. This was a decades-long campaign of deliberate murder and attempted murder, conducted by a woman who attended church, who smiled at her co-workers at the Kroger checkout, who presented herself to the world as a pillar of ordinary, decent womanhood. She is a reminder that evil does not announce itself. It does not walk around wearing its intentions on its face. Sometimes it sits beside you in a pew. Sometimes it smiles at you over a checkout counter. And sometimes it has been quietly poisoning the people it is supposed to love for longer than anyone thought to look. We'll be right back with more cases after a moment. But first, if you haven't already, please subscribe to Cold Case Time and hit the like button on this video. Every like and subscription helps us keep producing deeply researched documentaries like this one. Leave a comment below telling us which case has shocked you the most so far. Case 5. Mary and Holder. The house on Pine Hill Road. There are categories of crime that criminologists and forensic psychologists call familicide, the killing of one's own family members, typically in a single catastrophic event. It is, statistically, one of the rarest categories of homicide. It is also, in terms of its human cost and psychological devastation to surviving communities, one of the most profound. On the 21st of November, 2011, McLeansville, North Carolina experienced a familicide that left 5 children dead and an entire community asking questions that would never be fully answered, because the woman who committed it took the answers with her when she turned the gun on herself. McLeansville is a small, unincorporated community in eastern Guilford County, the county that contains Greensboro, the 3rd largest city in North Carolina. It is rural in character, a community of modest homes and wide yards, where neighbors tend to know each other, and where the sudden eruption of violence of the kind that occurred that November morning in 2011 felt almost cosmically wrong. Mary Ann Holder was a mother. She had children living in her home on that morning, 5 of them. Their ages ranged across the elementary and middle school years. By all available accounts, nothing in the external presentation of the Holder household had prepared the community for what Mary Ann Holder was about to do. On the morning of November 21st, 2011, Mary Ann Holder shot 5 children inside her home in McLeansville, North Carolina, before turning the firearm on herself. All 5 children died. Holder also died from the self-inflicted gunshot wound. The Guilford County Sheriff's Office responded to the scene and found what investigators described as one of the most harrowing scenes in the county's modern law enforcement history. 5 children. Dead. Their mother dead beside them. A home that had, just hours earlier, been a place where children slept and ate and moved through the ordinary rhythms of childhood. The 5 children who died were identified as Holder's own children and stepchildren, ranging in age from young elementary school age to early adolescence. The youngest victims were among the most heartbreaking dimensions of a scene that offered no redemption and no mercy. Guilford County erupted in grief. Schools that the children had attended held counseling sessions. Neighbors who had waved at Mary Ann Holder from their driveways tried to reconcile the person they thought they knew with the person who had committed this act. In the days following the shooting, investigators and community members sought to understand what had driven Mary Ann Holder to commit this act. Reports indicated that Holder had been experiencing significant personal and financial difficulties in the period leading up to the shooting, and that her mental state had deteriorated in ways that, in retrospect, some who knew her identified as warning signs that had not been acted upon in time. Mental health advocates pointed to the case as a stark illustration of the consequences of untreated mental illness combined with access to firearms, and of the ways in which a mother's descent into crisis can, in the most catastrophic of outcomes, turn inward and destroy the children she was supposed to protect. Because Mary and Holder died at the scene, there was no trial. There was no opportunity for a jury to examine the evidence, for a judge to pronounce sentence, for the community to go through the legal ritual of accountability that true crime cases so often provide. What remained was 5 funerals, 5 empty chairs and 5 classrooms, 5 families, extended families, grandparents, aunts and uncles, cousins, left to make sense of a loss that had no perpetrator left standing to face them. The case remains one of the most cited examples of maternal familicide in North Carolina's recorded criminal history, a case that advocacy organizations and mental health professionals have returned to repeatedly in the years since, in discussions about early intervention, crisis support systems, and the protections that exist, or that fail to exist, for children whose parents are in psychological freefall. The 5 children killed by Mary and Holder on that November morning in 2011 are the center of this story. Not Mary and Holder's motives, not the circumstances of her life. The children, who had no say in any of it, who were in their own home on what should have been an ordinary Monday morning, are the reason this case must be remembered, must be discussed, and must be used as a call to do better. McLeansville, North Carolina carries the weight of that morning still. Thank you for staying with us through these difficult stories. If you're finding this documentary meaningful, please like this video, subscribe to Cold Case Time, and share it with someone in your life. Your support means everything to us and to the mission of keeping these victims' stories alive. Case 6, Andrea Faust, Durham, 2026. The ink on this case is barely dry. In the world of true crime documentary, we most often deal with cases that have been through the full arc of justice: investigation, trial, conviction, sentencing. The passage of time allows for perspective, for the accumulation of detail, for the kind of deep research that transforms a news headline into a fully understood story. The case of Andrea Faust in Durham, North Carolina, is different. It is one of the most recent cases in this documentary, a case that is, as of the production of this video, still moving through the legal system. We include it because the documented facts are established, because the charges are a matter of public record, and because to exclude it would be to fail the child who died and the child who survived. Andrea Faust was arrested and charged with first-degree murder in connection with the death of the child who did not survive, and with attempted murder in connection with the child who did. Both charges represent the most serious categories of violent crime under North Carolina law. The filing of first-degree murder and attempted murder charges in connection with the deaths of children in a domestic setting, particularly when the accused is the mother or caretaker of those children, reflects a prosecutorial determination that the evidence supports not merely negligence or recklessness, but intentional conduct. That determination is, of course, subject to the full examination of a trial. As of the most recent publicly available reporting on this case, Andrea Faust is in custody awaiting trial in Durham County. The case is proceeding through the North Carolina judicial system. In the tragedy of this case, there is one element that cuts through the darkness differently from the others. One child survived. There is a child who went through whatever happened in that home and came out alive. That child will carry the weight of this experience for the rest of their life, and the protection and healing of that child is a priority that must stand at the center of every decision made by the systems now involved in this case. The child who did not survive, whose death forms the basis of the murder charge against Andrea Faust, deserved better. Every child in this documentary deserved better. And it is the ongoing responsibility of the community, the courts, and the child welfare system to ensure that the surviving child now gets what they deserve: safety, care, and the chance to heal. We will continue to follow this case as it develops. If you want to stay updated as this case and others develop, please subscribe to Cold Case Time right now and hit the bell icon so you're notified the moment we publish new content. Like this video if you believe these stories deserve to be told. We appreciate every one of you. Case 7. Gudrun Linda Casper-Leinenkugel. The chemical in the cup. In the history of domestic poisoning cases, a category of crime with a long and documented history, there is a particular subcategory that stands apart from the others. It is the poisoning of a child by a parent. The crimes of Blanche Taylor Moore, examined earlier in this documentary, showed us what a female poisoner operating over decades can look like. The case of Gudrun Linda Casper-Leinenkugel of Asheville, North Carolina, shows us what that category of crime looks like in 2025, and it is every bit as disturbing. Asheville sits in the Blue Ridge Mountains in western North Carolina, a city celebrated for its arts community, its breweries, its eclectic culture, and the extraordinary natural beauty that surrounds it. It draws tourists from across the country and around the world. It is a city that prides itself on openness, on community, on the warmth of its people. It is also the city where, in 2025, Gudrun Linda Casper-Leinenkugel allegedly poisoned her own daughter's drink with a chemical designed to kill her. The details of the Casper-Leinenkugel case are, even within the disturbing context of this documentary, remarkable in their specificity and their darkness. Prosecutors allege that Gudrun Linda Casper-Leinenkugel introduced a chemical substance into her daughter's drink, a substance that, when metabolized by the human body, converts to cyanide. Cyanide is one of the most acutely lethal poisons known to exist, capable of causing rapid cellular death by preventing the body's cells from using oxygen. The decision to deploy cyanide, or more precisely, a cyanide precursor compound, against one's own child reflects a level of premeditation and specific knowledge that goes far beyond impulsive violence. You do not accidentally add a cyanide-converting chemical to a drink. You do not stumble into the possession of such a substance. Its use requires acquisition, planning, and the cold-blooded execution of a decision to poison another human being. That human being was her daughter. Casper-Leinenkugel faces multiple murder and attempted murder charges in connection with the poisoning. The case, which emerged in 2025, drew immediate attention from law enforcement toxicologists and from the broader forensic science community due to the specific nature of the poison alleged to have been used. Forensic psychiatrists and investigators who work in the field of domestic child abuse poisoning cases have long been familiar with a pattern of behavior known as factitious disorder imposed on another, previously called Munchausen syndrome by proxy, in which a caregiver, typically a mother, deliberately causes illness in a child, often for the purpose of generating medical attention, sympathy, or a sense of control. While it would be inappropriate to apply a clinical diagnosis to Gudrun Casper-Leinenkugel in advance of her trial, investigators and analysts who have examined the case have noted that the profile of a parent who deliberately introduces poison into a child's food or drink often overlaps significantly with this pattern. The deliberateness, the specificity of the substance chosen, the targeting of a family member who is dependent and trusting. The case against Casper-Leinenkugel was built in part on toxicological analysis of the drink in question and on the clinical presentation of the daughter following her exposure to the substance. Medical professionals who treated the daughter provided testimony and records that formed part of the investigative foundation for the charges filed. As of the most recent publicly available information, Gudrun Linda Casper-Leinenkugel remains in custody in Buncombe County, facing multiple counts of murder and attempted murder. Her case is proceeding through the North Carolina court system. Given the nature of the charges and the specificity of the evidence described by prosecutors, legal analysts watching the case anticipate that the trial will be one of the more technically complex domestic poisoning prosecutions in North Carolina's recent history, requiring the court to walk a jury through toxicological science, forensic chemistry, and the clinical effects of cyanide exposure, all in the context of a mother alleged to have deliberately targeted her own child. Asheville's community has followed the case with a mixture of shock and a grim determination to see the legal process run its course. The daughter at the center of this case deserves justice. She deserves the full weight of the North Carolina legal system bearing down on behalf of what was done to her. We will continue to follow this case as information becomes available. These are not easy stories to sit with, but they are important ones. If you believe in the mission of Cold Case Time, in the serious, respectful documentation of cases like this, please subscribe to this channel, hit that like button, and leave a comment below. Your engagement keeps this community going. Case 8. Samantha Lynn Higgins. 8 months old. There is a particular quality to the grief that surrounds the death of an infant, a grief that is, in some ways, beyond language. An 8-month-old baby is still new to the world in the most fundamental sense. 8 months old means first attempts at sitting up. It means recognizing faces. It means the beginning of that extraordinary developmental journey from helplessness toward personhood. It means absolute, total dependency on the adults responsible for that child's care. Buncombe County, North Carolina. 2022. An 8-month-old baby is dead. Samantha Lynn Higgins was charged in Buncombe County, North Carolina, in connection with the death of her 8-month-old baby. The investigation determined that the infant had died as a result of blunt force injuries combined with fentanyl exposure, a lethal combination that reflected both physical violence and drug involvement in the child's death. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that is, by weight, many times more potent than morphine. In adults, even small doses can cause dangerous respiratory depression and death. In infants, whose bodies are tiny, whose respiratory systems are fragile, whose capacity to metabolize such substances is essentially non-existent, fentanyl exposure at any meaningful level can be catastrophic. The combination of blunt force trauma and fentanyl exposure documented in this case painted a picture of an infant who had been subjected to both physical violence and drug exposure, a double assault on a body that had only been in the world for 8 months. Samantha Lynn Higgins was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in connection with the death of her infant. The involuntary manslaughter conviction reflects a legal determination that the death, while resulting from Higgins's conduct, did not meet the specific legal threshold of intentional first-degree murder, but that her behavior was sufficiently reckless and culpable to constitute criminal responsibility for the child's death. The distinction between involuntary manslaughter and first-degree murder in cases involving infant death is one that courts navigate carefully, weighing the specific evidence of intent, the circumstances of the household, and the forensic findings. In the Higgins case, the conviction reflects the jury and court's assessment that Higgins bore criminal responsibility for what happened to her child. The Higgins case is not an isolated one in the context of the fentanyl epidemic that has ravaged communities across the United States, including many counties in western North Carolina. Buncombe County, home to Asheville, has been among the North Carolina counties most significantly affected by the opioid crisis, with fentanyl driving a dramatic increase in overdose deaths in the years surrounding the Higgins case. Child welfare advocates and law enforcement officials have repeatedly highlighted the profound danger that fentanyl-involved households pose to infants and young children who cannot protect themselves from exposure. The death of Samantha Lynn Higgins' 8-month-old baby represents one of the most tragic dimensions of that epidemic, the way in which addiction, violence, and parental failure intersect to produce consequences that fall heaviest on those who are least able to bear them. 8 months old. The world was still entirely new, and it was taken away. Samantha Lynn Higgins received a sentence following her conviction on the involuntary manslaughter charge. While the involuntary manslaughter conviction carries a lighter sentence than first-degree murder, the case remains a matter of serious public record in Buncombe County, a documented instance of an infant's death resulting from the criminal conduct of the person responsible for that child's care. Every child who enters this world deserves to leave infancy safely. Every child deserves a caregiver who is present, who is sober, who is protective. This 8-month-old baby deserved all of those things. They did not receive them. And the accountability of Samantha Lynn Higgins, however incomplete it may feel in relation to the magnitude of what was lost, is the best the system can offer in response. We are grateful that you are still here with us. This documentary exists because these victims deserve witnesses, because their stories deserve to be told with the seriousness they demand. Please subscribe to Cold Case Time if you haven't already, and like this video to help us reach more viewers. Every notification bell you hit is a vote for keeping these stories alive. Case 9. Michelle LeAnn Morgan. The cold case that would not stay cold. The intersection of true crime and forensic science has produced, over the past several decades, one of the most significant developments in criminal justice. The ability to identify human remains that have been unidentified for years, sometimes decades, through advances in DNA analysis, isotopic testing, facial reconstruction, and the growing sophistication of national missing persons databases. This development has brought closure to families who had waited for years without answers. It has allowed investigators to reopen cases that had gone cold. And in some instances, it has led to the identification of killers who believe that the passage of time had buried their crimes permanently. The case associated with Michelle LeAnn Morgan is one that lives in this space, at the intersection of cold case investigation, forensic identification, and the long reach of justice. The details available in the public record surrounding this case are, in some respects, less comprehensively documented than some of the other cases in this documentary, in part because cold case investigations, by their nature, involve records that span years and multiple jurisdictions, and in part because the forensic identification processes involved unfold gradually, often without the concentrated media attention that accompanies high-profile active investigations. What is documented is this. Michelle LeAnn Morgan was convicted in connection with the killing of a young child in North Carolina, a case that, following the initial events, became a cold case investigation in the truest sense of the term. The case gained attention within forensic identification circles due to the methods used to ultimately establish the identity of the victim and the evidentiary chain that led to a conviction. Forensic professionals and investigators who worked on cold cases of this type noted it as a significant example of how advances in identification science could reach back years to establish accountability in cases that had appeared to be permanently unresolvable. Cold case investigations of this type rely heavily on a combination of traditional investigative work, interviews, document review, physical evidence re-examination, and newer forensic technologies that were simply not available at the time of the original events. DNA genealogy, which became widely used in criminal investigations in the latter part of the 2010s, has been particularly transformative in cold case, child homicide investigations. The ability to extract DNA from remains, build a genetic profile, and then cross-reference that profile against genealogical databases has allowed investigators to identify both victims and perpetrators in cases that have been dormant for decades. Isotopic analysis, which can, in some cases, help establish where an individual lived or traveled based on the chemical signatures left in bone tissue, has similarly expanded the toolkit available to investigators working on long cold cases. The documentation of Michelle LeAnn Morgan's case in forensic and investigative records underscores a fundamental truth about cold case investigation. The passage of time does not erase evidence. It transforms it. And in some cases, it preserves it in ways that only become useful when the science catches up. The conviction of Michelle LeAnn Morgan in connection with the death of a child whose remains were identified years after the crime represents one of the most important functions of the criminal justice system in cold case work. The demonstration that accountability does not expire. That the decision to harm a child, to hide what was done, to wait for the world to move on and forget, that decision does not lead to freedom. Cases of this type, in which forensic identification of remains years after the crime leads to prosecution and conviction, have been highlighted by law enforcement and advocacy organizations as critical deterrents, and as powerful demonstrations of the commitment of investigators to pursue justice regardless of how much time has passed. Cold cases do not stay cold forever. Not in North Carolina. Not in America. Not in a world where science is advancing faster than the passage of time can bury the truth. If this documentary has held your attention, if you believe these cold cases deserve the light, please subscribe to Cold Case Time right now, like this video, and share it with someone who needs to hear these stories. We are almost at the final case, and it is one of the most disturbing of all. Case 10, Angela McAnulty. The Oregon case that belongs to every conversation about evil. There are crimes so extreme, so prolonged, so relentlessly documented in their cruelty, that they become reference points. Cases that investigators, prosecutors, and forensic psychologists return to again and again when trying to understand the absolute outer boundary of what one human being can do to another. The case of Angela McAnulty is one of those reference points. While the murder of Jeanette Maples occurred in Oregon, specifically in Eugene, Oregon, Angela McAnulty's deep connections to North Carolina, her background in the state, and the frequency with which this case appears in regional true crime discussions of the worst crimes connected to the state, make it an essential inclusion in any comprehensive examination of maternal evil rooted in this geography. This is also, in many ways, the case in this documentary that demands the most from you as a viewer. What was done to Jeanette Maples, is almost beyond the capacity of ordinary language to convey. We will convey it anyway, because Jeanette deserves nothing less than the full, unflinching truth of what happened to her. Jeanette Maples was born on the 21st of May, 1995. She was 15 years old when she died in December of 2009. She was the biological daughter of Angela McAnulty. She was, by the time of her death, unrecognizable from the girl she had once been, not because time had changed her, but because her mother had destroyed her. Jeanette Maples died on December 9, 2009, in Eugene, Oregon. Her death was the culmination of years of abuse so severe that the Lane County Medical Examiner, in describing her condition at death, noted that her injuries were among the most extreme documented in a child abuse fatality in the region's recorded history. What Angela McAnulty subjected Jeanette to over the course of years was not discipline, however distorted. It was not even abuse in the commonly understood sense of the word, which still carries a connotation of being something done in anger, in frustration, in a loss of control. What Angela McAnulty did to Jeanette Maples was systematic. It was structured. It was, in the most clinical and terrible sense of the word, methodical. Investigators who examined the case documented that Jeanette had been subjected to prolonged starvation, forced to sleep on a hard floor, denied basic medical care, isolated from the outside world, and subjected to repeated physical violence over a period of years. At the time of her death, her body showed the cumulative effects of chronic malnutrition and repeated physical trauma. The other children in the McAnulty household were, by accounts documented in the investigation and trial, treated normally, fed, clothed, given the ordinary provisions of childhood. Jeanette alone was singled out for what investigators described as targeted, intentional, sustained cruelty. This selectivity is one of the most psychologically disturbing elements of the case. Angela McAnulty was not simply a mother who had broken down under the pressures of parenthood. She was a mother who looked at her children and selected one of them for destruction. She maintained the appearance of an ordinary household for the children she chose to protect, while methodically torturing the one she had selected to destroy. Jeanette Maples was brought to a hospital in Eugene, Oregon on December 9, 2009, already unresponsive. She was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. Medical personnel who received her were immediately alerted to the nature and extent of her injuries. Injuries that were entirely inconsistent with any accidental cause, and that bore the unmistakable signature of prolonged, deliberate abuse. The Lane County Medical Examiner determined that Jeanette died as a result of hypothermia, combined with the cumulative effects of the chronic abuse she had endured. Her body weight at the time of death was dramatically below what would be expected for a 15-year-old girl, the result of sustained starvation over an extended period. Angela McAnulty was arrested. Her husband, Richard McAnulty, was also taken into custody. Angela McAnulty was tried in Oregon for the murder of Jeanette Maples. The trial presented evidence of the full scope of the abuse, the starvation, the physical violence, the isolation, the years of systematic cruelty. The jury heard from medical professionals, from investigators, from individuals who had contact with the family, and from the forensic record of what Jeanette's body bore witness to. Angela McAnulty was convicted of aggravated murder and sentenced to death. She became one of the very few women in the United States to be sentenced to death in the modern era. The Oregon jury, having heard the full evidence of what had been done to Jeanette Maples, determined that no other sentence was sufficient. Richard McAnulty, Jeanette's stepfather, was also convicted in connection with the case and received a significant prison sentence for his role in the abuse and death of Jeanette Maples. Angela McAnulty's significant ties to North Carolina have made this case a consistent feature of discussions about the worst maternal crimes connected to the state. Her background, her family connections, and the trajectory of her life before the events in Oregon have all been documented in connection with the North Carolina communities from which she came. Investigative profiles of Angela McAnulty in the years following her conviction have traced her history through multiple states and circumstances, including her connections to North Carolina, in an effort to understand the origins and development of the personality capable of what was done to Jeanette Maples. She was 15. She liked music. She had once been a child who laughed. She had once been small and entirely new to the world, as all children are, and she had grown into a teenager who had an absolute human right to grow further still, to finish school, to fall in love, to figure out who she was and what she wanted from her life. Angela McAnulty took all of that. Year by year, she took it. She took Jeanette's nutrition. She took her warmth. She took her medical care. She took her connection to the world outside the walls of that house. And on December 9th, 2009, she took the last thing there was left to take. Jeanette Maples deserved better than every single thing that happened to her. And the only comfort, the only thin, cold comfort, available in the aftermath of her story is that Angela McAnulty will never, for as long as she lives, be free. These 10 stories are now told. Every one of them is real. Every victim in this documentary was a real human being who deserved protection, love, and the chance to live their life. If you have stayed with us through all 10 cases, thank you. Please, right now, hit that like button, subscribe to Cold Case Time if you haven't already, and drop a comment below. Tell us which case affected you the most. Tell us if there's a case you want us to cover next. Your engagement makes this channel possible, and every comment, every like, every subscription is a small act of solidarity with the victims whose stories we tell. Hit the subscribe button. Hit the bell. Share this documentary. We'll see you on the next one. You have now heard 10 stories, 10 cases, 10 victims, most of them children, all of them deserving of better than what they received. You have heard about Zara Baker, the cancer survivor from Australia who crossed an ocean and found, instead of safety, a stepmother who would take everything from her. You have heard about a nameless newborn boy in Union County who never had the chance to be given a name before he was taken from this world. You have heard about 4-year-old twin boys in Murphy who were found by their father during what should have been a routine custody exchange. You have heard about Blanche Taylor Moore, who poisoned her way through decades and relationships, hiding her murders behind the face of a church-going, ordinary woman. You have heard about 5 children in McLeansville who did not survive a single catastrophic November morning. You have heard about children in Durham and Asheville whose cases are still moving through the courts, still being weighed by the system that has been assigned the task of seeking justice on their behalf. You have heard about an 8-month-old baby in Buncombe County who encountered the lethal intersection of violence and drugs in the place that was supposed to be their sanctuary. You have heard about the cold case work that brought accountability to a case that might otherwise have been forgotten. And you have heard about Jeanette Maples, 15 years old, singled out, systematically destroyed, a name that should be spoken aloud and remembered. What do these 10 cases have in common, beyond geography and the gender of the perpetrator? What thread runs through them that is worth examining, worth naming? Several things. One of the most consistent features of the cases in this documentary is how invisible the victims were to the systems that should have seen them. Zara Baker was not in school. She had no teachers, no classmates, no social workers regularly checking in. She was a disabled child living in a household that had been flagged before, and she fell through every crack that existed. The newborn killed by Khrystina Marie Rice had not yet been registered with any system at all. He existed outside every database, every record, every mechanism of oversight. The twin boys in Murphy were in the care of their mother between custody exchanges, precisely the windows of time that the child welfare system is least equipped to monitor. Across these cases, we see again and again that the children most at risk are the children least visible to the public structures designed to protect them. This is not a North Carolina problem. It is not a regional problem. It is a national crisis in child protection that these 10 cases illuminate with painful clarity. Blanche Taylor Moore attended church for decades while poisoning the people closest to her. Elisa Baker called 911 and filed a missing persons report while having already dismembered the child she killed. Multiple perpetrators in this documentary maintained, for extended periods, the outward appearance of ordinary family life while committing or concealing extraordinary violence behind closed doors. The capacity to perform normalcy, to present one face to the world while doing something entirely different in private, is one of the most consistent features of the perpetrators in cases like these. It is a capacity that defeats casual observation, that defeats the kind of community surveillance that might otherwise catch warning signs, and that makes the work of investigators both more difficult and more important. In several of the cases in this documentary, there are survivors, individuals who were in the same households, who witnessed or were adjacent to what happened, who carry the weight of that proximity for the rest of their lives. Adam Baker, Zara's father, has spoken publicly about the trauma of what happened to his daughter and his own role in failing to protect her. The father who arrived for a custody exchange in Murphy and found his sons gone will carry that mourning with him for the rest of his life. The child who survived in the Durham case will need years, possibly decades, of care and support to navigate what happened. Survivors of child murder and abuse don't appear in headlines the way perpetrators do, but their lives are profoundly shaped by what they witnessed, what they experienced, what they lost. The systems that handle these cases bear a responsibility not only to prosecute the perpetrators, but to support and protect those who survive. True crime, when practiced responsibly, serves a vital function. It is not entertainment in the traditional sense. It is witness-bearing. It is the communal act of saying, "This happened, it mattered, we refuse to let it be forgotten." Every name in this documentary belongs to a real human being. Zora Baker, the baby boy of Khrystina Rice. The twin sons in Murphy. Raymond Reed, poisoned by Blanche Moore. The 5 children of Mary and Holder. The children in Durham. The daughter in Asheville. The 8-month-old in Buncombe County. The cold case child. Jeanette Maples. These are not statistics. They are not case numbers. They are not data points in a true crime taxonomy. They are people. People who were small and new and dependent on the adults around them to keep them safe. And they were failed. Catastrophically, criminally, irreversibly failed. Remembering them is the least we can do.